Nous allons du coup très vite passer à la présentation de Dany Jacob, qui sera elle aussi en anglais. Alors, Dany Jacob est originaire du Luxembourg. Il est lecteur à Michigan Technological University. Il a soutenu une thèse à SUNY, à Buffalo, en français et en études francophones. Sa recherche actuelle se situe sur le dandy en tant que figure pivot qui englobe à la fois la trajectoire des masculinités dans la pensée socioculturelle occidentale, ainsi que la façon dont il affecte notre perception contemporaine de la modernité, de l'esthétique et de la masculinité à travers la lentille, vue à travers la lentille du fétichisme. Ces autres recherches s'intéressent aux masculinités queer et à leur performativité dans la littérature et dans les médias, aux identités culturelles et à leur mobilité dans leurs espaces respectifs. Il travaille actuellement sur un manuscrit qui expose un nouveau cadre sur l'effet dandy et sur plusieurs autres articles. Alors, il va nous présenter, il va faire une communication intitulée Under the Lights of Stardom, Todrick Hall's Performative Paradox in Representing Multi-Minority Groups in the USA. C'est à vous, Dany.
Je voudrais remercier les organisateurs du colloque ainsi que du panel pour cette occasion de parler justement d'un de mes multiples projets concernant la performativité, surtout en ce qui concerne justement les identités queer. Donc, je commence. Todrick Hall has become increasingly important in the LGBTQIA plus scene in the past years. As a minor celebrity on Broadway and then on YouTube, his ascension to stardom as well as his media presence are accelerated with the release of his albums. But ultimately, it is his participation during RuPaul's Drag Race that will brand him as a house name in the community. Lately, however, coinciding with the release of his latest EP album, House Party Part 1 and Part 2, he has made a name for himself as an ambassador for the LGBTQIA cause on an international level. Whilst Hall is providing his voice for the gay community as well as for the Black minority in the US, his notoriety and visibility remain problematic in their respective social cultural contexts. Historically and socially, the fundamental conflicts in Western societies arise from a confrontation of established narrative. Here, of course, the heteronormative, white, patriarchal discourse by what we commonly call minorities. Taking the lead from Linda Alcoff in Visible Identities in her feminist critical approach to minorities and their identity, there are three axes of discussion to consider. First, race and gender are predominantly known and accepted as being the biggest group of minorities due to their nature. Alcoff explains here in quote, race and gender are forms of social identity that share at least two features. They are fundamental rather than peripheral to the self, and they operate through visual markers of the body, end quote. That does not mean that sexuality, the third axis, does not have its role in this type of discussion as well. But as Alcoff continues, quote, homosexuality can be rendered invisible on the street, end quote, unless it's marked visually by clothes or mannerism that signals to the majority how fundamentally different the subject is. This last point is of particular importance to us here because Todrick Hall situates himself at the center of such discussion, not just because he is a gay Black artist, but more so because he oftentimes always performs in drag. Butler makes a point to consider drag performance that drag performances show how gender construction are, quote, falsely naturalized as a unity through the regulatory fiction of heterosexual coherence, end quote. Thus, Todrick Hall's presence and performance render complex rendition of intersectionality in regards to multiple minorities. As such, he seems to be in dialogue with several delicate and sensitive contemporary issues related to these different aspects of his social identity. Arguably, he's framed as a heavily mediatized, emblematic voice appealing to minority communities, but he also seems to raise many concerns within the communities in regards to his personal stance towards the contemporary dominant sociocultural discourse. As an artist and a performer, it is especially important to take into consideration the factor and the weight of his audience and how the latter might experience and or understand Hall's interpretation of their social divergence. Emulating Alkov's tripart critical approach, sexuality, race, and gender, we wish to deliberate Hall's performance in their intersectionality, but also in its reception. Let's take a close look to Todrick Hall's autobiographical revelations, heavily present in his first music album, in Straight Outta Oz. In Straight Out of Oz, the artist presents a biographical mosaic underscoring his struggles and his accomplishments, despite being a young Black man in Texas, here underlined in bold. Much like the myth of the Wizard of Oz, on which Hall riffs here, the music album comes to represent his own maturation process, but also how he finally grew into the man he is now. An homage to a minority being successful against all the odds. In many ways, it can be perceived as a call to all minorities to believe in themselves and surpass their oppression. His latest album, however, adorns a very different tone, which remains highly problematic since it really relies heavily on queer pride and dealing with identity cliches within the community. Hall is more intense in his text and topic. Most of the titles are less concerned with intimate and introspective reflection, but instead promote explicit sexuality, his or abstract. Pushing at the discretion of social taboos when it comes to gay sexuality, Hall exploits the usual negative preconceptions of the community and seems to favor blatant performativity instead. By playing forcefully on effeminacy, expressive lighthearted sexuality, and constant objectification of bodies, mostly male, it can be argued that if Hall's statement to liberate the community of the usual social prejudices are undoing his previous manifesto instead of building onto it. The racial critical lens sheds further light in this aspect. While Todrick Hall is undoubtedly an excellent performer, he's mostly known to be a Black artist, and as such, he carries a substantial cultural baggage. As we have mentioned before, his first album dealt with sensitive topics: absent father figure in Black families, dealing with police violence, the importance of church and gospel music, etc., etc. As such, Straight Out of Oz gives us a taste of the social cultural microclimate that blankets over the US when it comes to race and being a minority. Evidently, he is far from being the only Black artist to transform this testimony into art to share it with his audiences. His talent resides in using the Wizard of Oz myth as a cultural bridge. Since the Wizard of Oz is widely accepted a cultural and queer commonplace, it allows a variety of audiences to understand the honesty and poetic image Al uses in this context and framework. Contemporary literature on Blackness and Black culture, some of the quotes are shown here, but can't develop because of time constraints, illustrates the variety of abuse and difficulties that exist for a Black gay man within the Black community. With that in mind, Todrick Hall's presence and visibility on media platforms becomes increasingly problematic within the articulation of Black performativity. In hindsight, when we take a look at his first YouTube video, Beauty and the Beat, the artist presents a critical performance that seems to come straight out of American political satires. Some would argue that Hall invited several Black artists in his video. We can still not get past the obviously stereotypical roles that they have taken on, screaming and driving by shooting being the biggest examples here. This is clear. It is clear that the rearticulation of Beauty and the Beast is meant to be a parody. But it can also be argued that Hall bangs on what most, and here I understand, white people think being Black in the US is like. Taylor Mim's recent article in Billboard backs up our argument. We'll talk about it in a minute. Where Hall's earlier videos and performances center around Blackness were never done truthfully or realistically, but rather in an extreme performative and parodied way, which in theory is not a problem, if it was not such a catch-22 situation. Bringing Black YouTubers and influencers, community figures, or even big names forward is a great exposure and important in order to establish visibility in the Black community. But it is soon undermined by the stereotypical parts they're asked to display. Plugging his brethren in stereotypical scenarios in extreme farce-esque performances seem to harden the white audience's racial preconception of Black culture instead of liberating it from said audience's oppression. His latest album echoes our similar observation in racial representation and performance. In this video clip, Drebisha, in collaboration with actress and stand-up comedian Tiffany Haddish, the audience is subjected to a row of outdated and exaggeration of images of the Black woman. Get her name, gold grill, acrylic fingernails in neon colors, and over-the-head hairdo. The visuals and the lyrics all highlight characteristical elements of the proud Black woman that Hall seems to exploit in depth, which contrasts starkly with previous efforts to glam up such an image. Here, refer back here to the movie Babs from 1997. This point takes on further roots if you consider Sam article here in Gay Times applauding Hall's, quote here, sickening booty bopping dance anthem, end quote, and finding his video, quote unquote, hilarious. Taking this into account, we can conclude that Todrick Hall plays on a white audience expectation, even though the topic is about Black identity and performance, which has become increasingly unacceptable in today's public opinion, especially in light of the Black Lives Matter movements during the 2020 pandemic. Hall answers to some of these concerns in Taylor Mim's Billboard article here. I'm not going to read it all, but I'm going to highlight the bold part here. I try to compensate and prove my Blackness, and then sometimes I'm like, but I don't feel support by my Black community, so I don't need to try to sell it to them. I just sell to whoever wants to buy my music, unquote. The constant background presence of white audience enhances another serious point in this conversation: body image issues in the gay community. Critical feminist theory already have highlighted the abuse and omnipresence of the heteronormative gaze. Think Mulvey's theory on the male gaze, obviously, and advocating for the abolition of such body image framing for women. The fight has not yet reached the concerns of body image in the LGBTQ community. Hall's visuals and text reflect a conservative narrative in the portrayal of male bodies, especially when it banks on gay body stereotypes, bouncy and juicy booty, etc. In this video, behind the scenes of I Like Boys, Hall admits that he would have liked to have more body diversity, but he conceded to social expectations. In his video clips, then, he is surrounded by what society considers to be desirable male bodies, ready to be objectified by the male and gay gaze. But he himself stands out by being mostly in drag. This performance choice seems to split Hall's image and identity when it comes to media representation and narratives. Taking into account Butler's theories on performativity and Connell's critical perspective on masculinities, Todrick Hall seems to confirm that there are two acceptable models: to be a muscle god or to be a drag queen. Yet this Manichaeism clashes with the rich history and rapidly expanding identities possible in the LGBTQ plus realm that the performer does not seem to acknowledge whatsoever. This insight is further cemented once we take a closer look to the lexicon used in the clip nails, hair, hips, and heels. The single clearly refers back to the ballroom culture, a rich and important culture niche in the LGBTQ history. The contrariety here remains in a certain nonchalance of reappropriating this culture to make it a universal sensation, much like we've seen when RuPaul's Drag Race with Malco's presentation earlier. Some recent debates on that topic, however, have articulated an issue of appropriation of Black culture, of Black and or queer mannerism in the mainstream. Understand here again, white audience. Since Hall does not seem to make any effort to reference to these cultural rules, It's usually done by his critics, not by himself, or even use the proper vocabulary in his lyrics. There's a lot of debate on using the right words. His performances are growing to become vexing as they lose their meaning in ideological values, in their crucial historization, or even in their responsibilities to LGBTQIA rights. That being said, however, it would be irresponsible of us to assume that Todrick Hall is the sole perpetrator in this line of thought. When talking about Hall's earlier work, Kyle Turner here writes, Hall's video are the product of culture that watches RuPaul's Drag Race, but cherry picks the easy stuff. And I'm glossing over to the bold part. The videos use them as objects and accessories, not statements or tools with which oppressive systems could be commented upon. I'm going to end the quote here. The problem is not that the content is flawed in its composition, but more so that its absorption is made too easy because of its media. Much like other cultural ready-mades, this product, quote unquote, becomes a simple plug-in tool for younger generation where it is important to show that you're hip and up to date with diverse discourses. This particular problem seems to feed into more critical discussion around the woke movement and what Alkov calls in her works the whatness question. There exists a certain responsibility and a duty for multi-minorities artists to in knowing and recognizing the struggles of their people and to make a point in educating their audience. It becomes especially important when they are Black and queer and when they desire to reach out to the next generations. Today's audience, and thus Hall's target audience, seems to be mainly younger, less diverse in minority, be it racial or in the LGBTQ spectrum, but also ignorant of the community's historical actions. They are eager to consume the fruits of such social cultural labor, as it is the case with the highly popular show RuPaul's Drag Race, for example. They do not understand the full weight of the struggles that made it possible for such performances to become acceptable, even less so to become widely mainstream. The audience absorbs this culture and reproduces it emptied of its proper context. Such a shift in cultural appropriation is also present in Todrick Hall's performances, since the audience does not get a complete overview of its importance in the LGBTQ identities. His parodic exaggerations are taken for granted and are commonplace in their respective circles to be then popularized outside of the community. Consequently, Hall does not respond to the demands and needs of his community, be it the Black or the queer one. From his general behavior and attitude, it looks like he identifies himself more as a gay man than a Black gay man, which causes a rift in their respective communities. In light of recent allegation of racial slurs and sexual harassment that cling themselves here in the same scope. Black dancers, for example, are fighting to get paid or pushed into the background because they are too chocolate, while white men are sexually harassed by Todrick Hall. We have to consider that the reality that Hall prefers to reinforce the need to become a mainstream idol and almost a normative queer model, even if that means leaving his Black heritage behind. In so doing, he strays away from other Black artists like Janelle Monáe, for example, who stand their ground in their multiple minorities. She is Black, female, and bisexual/pansexual. And rather to capitalize on one of her minorities, she takes advantage of her position to reinforce their intersectional identity and to become a role model for everybody. Here's a quick excerpt from the song American, where she wants to fight for everybody's rights, again here in bold for your convenience. The question is the underlying question, and that's difference in Hall's queerness, difference in Hall's performance, his queerness on top of his Blackness. Without a doubt, we think we can conclude that Hall is a fantastic and talented dancer and singer, and a true performer if his drag performances are any testimony to his mastery of the art. As a judge on RuPaul's Drag Race, he seems to be the most in tune with his intersexual identity, and thus the most honest and human when he addresses the queen by their talents. Why then now carry this attitude outwards in the outside of the competition space? Again, here, another catch-22, one that Paul is painfully aware of here is the quote, And again, I'm going to skip to the bold part. It's almost like we like complaining about the fact that there isn't enough representation, but then when there's representation, but then when representation is there and it doesn't come in the exact package or the exact size that we wished it had been in, we bash it as well. We know that Blackness is not monolithic, a monolithic identity. It exists on the spectrum. In this 2008 article of kingsofreads.com, Justin James engages with Todrick Hall's work and comments, one cannot be too Black or not Black enough. We all exist. Todrick, you say that not being Black enough haunts you, but what have you done about it, end quote. Many of the communities feel the same way, especially after his lofty speeches about needing more LGBTQ representations at Pride events to reinforce a sense of community and seeing oneself in media and on stage. The role of an ambassador is to carry the burden to know all of its history in order to portray it correctly and proudly, and not to whitewash, pun intended here, in order to feed it to eager consumers in exchange for work for a woke, fad of the moment type adoration. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Dany, pour cet exposé extrêmement éclairant.